The rain poured down hard that morning as the yellow school bus pulled up to the grand entrance of Westfield Academy. Among the students rushing to escape the downpour was Thomas, a 12-year-old boy with deep brown eyes that seemed too old for his young face. He stood out immediately, not just because of his dark skin in a sea of mostly white faces, but because of his ill-fitting uniform that had clearly been worn by someone else before him. Thomas clutched his backpack tightly against his chest like a shield. This was his third day at the fancy private school, and already he wished he could disappear. Back in his old neighborhood school, he'd had friends. Here, he was the scholarship kid, words that followed him through the hallways like an unwelcome shadow. Remember what Grandma said, he whispered to himself as he walked through the massive oak doors. Keep your head up, do your work, and don't give them a reason. The marble floors of Westfield Academy shone so bright that Thomas could almost see his reflection in them. The walls were covered with paintings of important-looking white men in fancy clothes and old-fashioned portraits of past headmasters. Nothing in this place looked like Thomas or reminded him of home. In his first class, history, Thomas sat in the back corner. The teacher, Mr. Powell, spoke about European kings and queens with such excitement that his bow tie seemed to bounce with each word. When he asked the class a question about Queen Victoria, Thomas knew the answer from a book his grandma had given him, but he kept his hand down. The last time he'd answered correctly, the boy sitting next to him had whispered, "Lucky guess." During lunch, Thomas found a quiet spot under the stairwell. He unwrapped the sandwich his grandma had made him that morning, peanut butter and banana on slightly stale bread. 3 tables away, a group of boys in perfectly pressed uniforms laughed loudly as they traded expensive-looking snacks from home. "You're not supposed to eat there," a voice said, making Thomas jump. A janitor with kind eyes stood over him. "Health and safety rules." Thomas quickly gathered his things, his cheeks burning with shame. "Sorry, sir, I didn't know." The janitor's expression softened. "There's a bench outside by the oak tree. Nice and quiet there." He paused. "I ate there myself when I first started working here 30 years ago." Thomas nodded gratefully and hurried outside, feeling the stairs follow him all the way out the door. His last class of the day was music with Mrs. Blackwell. The music room was Thomas's favorite place so far. It reminded him of his grandma's living room, where an old upright piano stood against the wall, the only thing his grandma had kept when they had to move to the smaller apartment. Mrs. Blackwell was a thin woman with silver hair, pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her glasses hung from a chain around her neck, and she used them mainly to look down at students she found disappointing. Thomas had quickly learned he belonged in that category. "Today we'll be continuing our exploration of classical composers," she announced, writing Mozart on the whiteboard with precise letters. "Can anyone tell me what makes Mozart's compositions unique?" Several hands shot up. Mrs. Blackwell called on a girl with perfect blonde braids who gave an answer that sounded like it came straight from a textbook. "Excellent, Charlotte," Mrs. Blackwell beamed. "Now let's listen to this piece and identify the instruments we hear." As the music filled the room, Thomas closed his eyes. He couldn't help it. Whenever he heard music, something inside him just took over. His fingers tapped lightly on his desk, following the melody perfectly. The notes called to him like old friends. Perhaps our new student would like to share his thoughts since he seems so engaged. Mrs. Blackwell's voice cut through the music. The room fell silent as 20 pairs of eyes turned to Thomas. His heart pounded in his chest. At his old school, his music teacher had called him a natural. Here, he already knew what they thought of him. But as he looked at Mrs. Blackwell's expectant face, Thomas made a choice. He would no longer hide. "That's Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21, he said quietly. "My grandma says it's called Elvira Madigan because it was in that movie." Mrs. Blackwell's eyebrows shot up so high they almost disappeared into her hairline. Thomas knew that look well. It was the same look teachers always had when they thought a kid like him should know something. Little did they know what would happen tomorrow when they put him in front of that piano. The next day arrived with clear skies, but Thomas felt a storm brewing inside him. After his comment about Mozart in yesterday's class, he'd overheard 2 boys laughing about the charity case trying to show off. He'd spent the morning with his head down, trying to blend into the walls. When the bell rang for music class, Thomas's stomach tightened into a knot. He walked slowly, letting other students rush past him. The music room door felt heavier today as he pushed it open. Mrs. Blackwell stood at the front, her thin lips pressed together as students filed in. The grand piano in the corner gleamed under the lights, its polished surface reflecting the faces of students who'd likely taken expensive private lessons their whole lives. Today, Mrs. Blackwell announced, tapping her baton against her palm, we will be exploring the emotional qualities of Chopin's work. She placed a CD into the player and pressed play. Listened carefully to the mood being created. Beautiful, haunting piano notes filled the room. Thomas couldn't help himself. His fingers began moving on his desk again, following the melody perfectly. He knew this piece. His grandma had played it often when she thought he was asleep, her old hands moving across their worn-out piano keys with surprising grace. Mrs. Blackwell's sharp eyes caught his movement. She stopped the music abruptly. The silence felt like a slap. It seems our newest student is quite eager to participate today, she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Perhaps you'd like to tell us something about what we just heard. The class turned to look at Thomas. Charlotte, the girl with perfect blonde braids, smirked at her friend. Thomas swallowed hard. It's Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, he said quietly. My grandma plays it. Mrs. Blackwell's eyebrows shot up. Does she now? She glanced at the other students, who were watching with growing interest. Some had small smiles forming, expecting Thomas to be put in his place. Well then, Mrs. Blackwell continued, walking slowly toward the grand piano. Since you seem to be such an expert on Chopin, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your knowledge for the class. A few snickers broke out. One boy whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This should be good." Thomas felt his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Mrs. Blackwell was pointing to the piano now, her face wearing an expression that clearly said she expected him to embarrass himself. Come now, she urged when he didn't move. Don't be shy. Show us what your grandmother taught you. Thomas stood up slowly. His legs felt like they were made of lead as he walked to the piano. The whispers and quiet laughter followed him like shadows. I bet he can't even read music, someone whispered. $5 says he plays chopsticks, another replied. The piano bench felt cold as Thomas sat down. He stared at the keys, so much cleaner and whiter than his grandma's old yellowed ones. For a moment, he considered running out of the room. But then he remembered his grandma's words from when he got the scholarship. There will be people who think you don't belong, she told him. Your job isn't to prove them right. Thomas placed his hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. He didn't need sheet music. He didn't need to look at the keys. The music was already inside him, had been since he was 5 years old, and his grandma first placed his small fingers on her piano. Mrs. Blackwell cleared her throat impatiently. We're waiting, she said. Thomas pushed down on the first key, then the second. And then, as if something else took control of his hands, he began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the room, not stumbling or hesitant, but flowing with emotion and precision that took years to develop. His small fingers stretched across the keys, dancing through complicated runs and delicate passages that professional pianists struggled with. The smirks disappeared from his classmates' faces. Mrs. Blackwell's mouth fell open slightly, the baton in her hand frozen mid-tap. No one moved. No one whispered. Every eye in the room was fixed on Thomas's hands as they brought the beautiful piece to life. Thomas lost himself in the music, forgetting where he was. In his mind, he was back in his grandma's small living room, playing on their old upright while she hummed along from her rocking chair. He played with his eyes closed, feeling rather than seeing the keys, pouring everything he couldn't say into the music. What no one in that classroom knew was that the storm inside Thomas was finally breaking free. The final notes hung in the air like magic. Thomas slowly opened his eyes, coming back to reality. The music room was completely silent. No whispers, no snickers, no shuffling of feet or rustling of papers. Just 23 faces staring at him with wide eyes and open mouths. Mrs. Blackwell stood frozen, her baton hanging limply at her side. Her face had lost its pinched look, replaced by something Thomas couldn't quite read: shock, confusion, and maybe something else. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to make sense of what just happened. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. Had he done something wrong? The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable. He started to stand up from the piano bench when one boy in the back, a quiet kid with glasses who had never spoken to Thomas before, began to clap. The sound seemed to break the spell. Another student joined in, then another. Soon the whole class was applauding, some even standing up. One tall boy in the front row let out a whistle that earned him a sharp look from Mrs. Blackwell, though she seemed too stunned to actually scold him. That was unexpected, Mrs. Blackwell finally said, her voice slightly higher than normal. She cleared her throat. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Thomas looked down at his hands. "My grandma taught me. She used to play in jazz clubs before I was born. We don't have money for lessons, but she showed me everything she knows." Without formal training, without sheet music. Mrs. Blackwell's voice held disbelief, but not the mocking kind from earlier. This was different, almost respectful. Thomas nodded. "I can play most things after I hear them once or twice. Grandma says I have a good ear." "A good ear?" Mrs. Blackwell repeated faintly. "Young man, what you have is extraordinary." The bell rang, making everyone jump. For a moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, students began gathering their things, many still glancing at Thomas with new interest in their eyes. As they filed out, several nodded at him or gave small smiles, the first friendly gestures he'd received since arriving at Westfield. Charlotte, the girl with perfect braids who had smirked at him earlier, lingered by the door. "My dad paid for piano lessons since I was 4, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I still can't play Baladno, 1. Then she hurried out, leaving Thomas blinking in surprise. Mrs. Blackwell was writing something in her notebook, her hand moving quickly across the page. "You may go now," she said without looking up. Thomas gathered his books and headed for the door. Just as he reached it, Mrs. Blackwell called out, "Thomas." He turned. "Yes, Mom." "Tomorrow," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I'd like you to come during lunch period. There's something I want to discuss with you." Thomas's stomach stank. Was he in trouble? Had he shown off too much? "Yes, ma'am," he replied quietly. Walking through the hallway felt different now. Students who had previously looked right through him now stared openly. A group of older kids stopped talking as he passed, one of them pointing and whispering to the others. Word traveled fast at Westfield Academy. By the time Thomas reached his last class, the news had spread everywhere. His math teacher, Mr. Wilson, who had never called on him before, suddenly asked, "Thomas, would you like to solve this problem for us?" 3 different students offered him pencils when he couldn't find his own. It was strange and uncomfortable. Thomas wasn't sure if he liked all the attention. Part of him wished he could go back to being invisible. When the final bell rang, Thomas hurried out to catch his bus. As he passed the teacher's lounge, he heard voices floating through the half-open door. "Never seen anything like it," a woman's voice said. It sounded like Mrs. Blackwell. "The boy's a natural prodigy." "Are you sure?" A man replied. "Perhaps he's had lessons somewhere else." "I called his grandmother during my free period," Mrs. Blackwell said. "They have an old piano that barely stays in tune. She taught him by ear because she can't afford lessons. She says he's been playing since he was 5. "Remarkable," another voice chimed in. "What do you plan to do about it?" Thomas didn't hear Mrs. Blackwell's answer. The hall monitor spotted him and shooed him away from the door. On the bus ride home, Thomas stared out the window, wondering what tomorrow would bring. He'd spent so long trying not to be noticed. Now he couldn't hide anymore. The thought made his hands sweat. What would Mrs. Blackwell want to talk about during lunch tomorrow? Whatever it was, Thomas had a feeling his life at Westfield Academy was about to change completely. Thomas barely slept that night. He tossed and turned, replaying the day's events in his mind. When his alarm clock finally buzzed at 6 a.m., he'd been awake for hours already. His grandma noticed something was off as he picked at his breakfast. "You're quiet this morning," she said, her eyes watching him carefully over her coffee mug. "Something happened at that fancy school." Thomas pushed his cereal around the bowl. "I played piano in music class yesterday." His grandma's face broke into a wide smile, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "Well now, that's wonderful. Did they like it?" "Yeah," Thomas mumbled. "Too much, maybe." His grandma set down her mug. "What do you mean, too much?" Thomas sighed. The teacher wants to see me during lunch today, and everyone's acting weird now, looking at me different. His grandma reached across the table and placed her worn hand over his. Baby, your gift is nothing to be ashamed of. You've got music in your soul that most people spend their whole lives looking for. But I don't want to be different, Thomas said quietly. I just want to fit in. Different isn't bad, she replied. It's just harder sometimes, but hiding who you are, that's the real shame. She squeezed his hand. Now eat your breakfast. Can't play piano on an empty stomach. The bus ride to school felt longer than usual. Thomas clutched his backpack tightly as he walked up the steps to the main entrance. Inside, he immediately noticed the stares and whispers following him down the hallway. A tall boy wearing a varsity jacket nodded at him. Hey, piano man, he said as Thomas passed. It wasn't exactly friendly, but it wasn't mean either. Morning classes dragged by. His English teacher, who had never spoken directly to him before, suddenly called on him 3 times. His history teacher asked him to stay after class, then awkwardly complimented his essay from last week. By the time lunch period arrived, Thomas's nerves were stretched thin. Instead of heading to the cafeteria, he made his way to the music room as Mrs. Blackwell had instructed. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway. The music room door was closed. Thomas knocked softly. Come in, Mrs. Blackwell's voice called. Thomas pushed open the door and froze. Mrs. Blackwell wasn't alone. The school principal, Dr. Harrison, stood beside her. So did an older man Thomas had never seen before, tall with silver hair and an expensive-looking suit. Ah, Thomas, Mrs. Blackwell said, her voice gentler than he'd ever heard it. Thank you for coming. This is Dr. Harrison, as you know, and this is Mr. Reynolds. He's the director of the City Symphony Orchestra. Thomas stood awkwardly just inside the doorway. Am I in trouble? Dr. Harrison laughed. Quite the opposite, young man. Please, come in and have a seat. Thomas walked slowly to the chair they'd placed near the piano. His heart was racing. I called your grandmother last night, Mrs. Blackwell said, surprising Thomas with this confirmation of what he'd overheard. She told me you've been playing since you were 5. Thomas nodded. And you've never had formal lessons? Mr. Reynolds asked, studying Thomas with intense interest. No, sir, Thomas replied. Just what my grandma taught me. Mr. Reynolds exchanged a look with the others. May I ask what else you can play? Thomas shrugged. Most things, if I hear them first. Mrs. Blackwell moved to the piano. Would you mind playing something else for us? Perhaps this? She placed a sheet of music on the stand, something Thomas had never seen before. I can't read music, Thomas admitted, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. Not really. Grandma tried to teach me a little, but... No matter, Mr. Reynolds said quickly. Mrs. Blackwell, would you play it once through? Mrs. Blackwell sat at the piano and began playing a complex piece with rapid finger movements and shifting tempos. Thomas watched her hands carefully, the notes filling his mind like water filling a cup. When she finished, Mr. Reynolds turned to Thomas. Would you like to try it? Thomas took Mrs. Blackwell's place at the piano. He closed his eyes for a moment, replaying the music in his head. Then his fingers found the keys, and he began. It wasn't perfect. He stumbled in 2 places and missed a few notes in the fastest section, but it was remarkably close for someone who had heard the piece only once. When he finished, the adults were staring at him with that now familiar look of amazement. That's Debussy, Mr. Reynolds said quietly. A piece that takes most students years to master. He turned to Dr. Harrison. This boy has a rare gift. Dr. Harrison nodded. Mrs. Blackwell and I have been discussing possibilities. Our school has a music scholarship fund that's rarely used. We believe Thomas would be an excellent candidate for private lessons. Thomas's head snapped up. Private lessons. But those cost a lot. The scholarship would cover it, Mrs. Blackwell explained. We'd need to speak with your grandmother, of course, Dr. Harrison added. Mr. Reynolds has also expressed interest in having you audition for the Youth Symphony program. Thomas's mind was spinning. Yesterday, these same people had barely noticed him. Mrs. Blackwell had tried to embarrass him. Now they were talking about scholarships and symphonies. May I ask why? Thomas said suddenly. The adults looked confused. Why what? Asked Dr. Harrison. Why now? Thomas clarified. Mrs. Blackwell, you didn't even like me before yesterday. Mrs. Blackwell had the decency to look uncomfortable. Thomas, You thought I didn't belong here. Thomas continued, finding courage he didn't know he had. None of you thought I belonged until I played piano. The room fell silent. The adults exchanged glances, no one quite sure how to respond to such honesty. Finally, Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat. Young man, talent has a way of making people see what they should have seen all along. Whether that's fair or right, well, that's a different question. The silence that followed Thomas's question hung heavy in the air. Dr. Harrison adjusted his tie nervously while Mrs. Blackwell stared at her hands folded in her lap. Finally, Dr. Harrison spoke up. You're right to question us, Thomas, and I don't have a good answer that will erase what you've experienced. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting Thomas's directly. But I can promise you this, we're trying to do better now. Thomas wasn't sure what to say. Part of him wanted to forgive them and accept their help. Another part felt angry that it took something special about him for them to see him as worthy. Mr. Reynolds broke the awkward silence. Thomas, talent like yours appears maybe once in a generation. It would be a crime to let it go undeveloped. Whatever brought us to this point, and I understand your reservations, I hope you'll consider the opportunity. Before Thomas could respond, the lunch bell rang. Dr. Harrison stood up. Think about it, Thomas. Talk to your grandmother. We'll set up a proper meeting with her later this week. As Thomas left the music room, his mind was swimming. The rest of the day passed in a blur. In his math class, the teacher called on him again, beaming when he got the answer right, as if his piano playing somehow made him better at fractions. On the bus ride home, Thomas sat alone as usual, but noticed several kids looking his way and whispering. Not mean whispers like before, but excited ones. A younger boy even asked if he could sit beside him, then spent the whole ride asking questions about how long he'd been playing piano. When Thomas got home, his grandma was waiting at the kitchen table. Next to her cup of tea was a piece of paper, a handwritten note. Your Mrs. Blackwell called again, she said, pushing the paper toward him. She left her home number. Wants me to call her back about some special program. Thomas dropped his backpack on the floor. They want to give me piano lessons, and maybe have me try out for some youth orchestra thing. His grandma's face lit up. Baby, that's wonderful. Is it though? Thomas sat heavily in the chair across from her. Yesterday they treated me like I didn't belong there. Now suddenly I'm special because I can play piano. His grandma was quiet for a long moment, stirring her tea thoughtfully. You know, when I was a young woman playing in those clubs, there were many doors closed to me because of the color of my skin. She set her spoon down. But music opened some of them. Not because music made me more worthy, I was always worthy, but because it made some people see past their own blindness. She reached across the table and took his hand. It's not fair that you have to be exceptional for them to treat you decent. It's not right. But the question is, what will you do with the door now that it's open? Thomas thought about this as he helped her prepare dinner. He thought about it as they ate. He thought about it as he practiced on their old upright piano later that evening, his fingers dancing across the yellowed keys that were nothing like the shiny ones at school. The next morning, Thomas felt different as he climbed the steps to Westfield Academy. He walked taller, his eyes meeting those of the students who now stared at him with newfound interest. His first class was English with Ms. Winters, a young teacher who had always been kind but distant. Today, she stopped him after class. Thomas, I heard you play, she said quietly. My classroom is next to the music room. It was beautiful. Thank you, he replied, surprised by her sincerity. I also heard how Mrs. Blackwell set that up, she added, her voice dropping even lower. I want you to know that not all of us, she paused, seeming to search for the right words. Not all of us needed your talent to see your worth. Before Thomas could respond, a group of students entered for the next class. Ms. Winters quickly handed him a book. I thought you might enjoy this. It's about a jazz pianist from the 1940s. Thomas tucked the book into his backpack, oddly touched by the gesture. During lunch, Thomas decided to explore the music room when no one was there. To his surprise, the door was unlocked. He slipped inside and sat at the piano, placing his fingers on the keys without pressing them, feeling their smooth coolness beneath his fingertips. I thought I might find you here." Thomas jumped at the voice. Mrs. Blackwell stood in the doorway, her thin frame silhouetted against the light from the hallway. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quickly, standing up. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right," she said, walking into the room. "You're welcome here anytime, Mal." Now, the word hung between them. Mrs. Blackwell sighed, removing her glasses. Without them, her face looked older, more tired. "Thomas, I owe you an apology. A real one, not just the convenient kind that makes me feel better." She sat on the piano bench, leaving space for him. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas sat beside her. "I've been teaching for 30 years, she said, "and in that time, I've developed expectations about who belongs in places like Westfield, about who has talent and who doesn't." She looked at her hands, the same hands that had wielded the baton like a weapon. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Thomas said nothing, not sure if he was ready to forgive. "Your grandmother must be an extraordinary teacher," Mrs. Blackwell continued. "She is," Thomas replied. "She says music is a way of speaking when words aren't enough." Mrs. Blackwell nodded. "She's right." She placed her hands on the keys and played a simple, melancholy melody. "Sometimes this says more than I ever could." Thomas recognized the piece. Chopin again, but different from what he played. Without thinking, he joined in, adding a harmony that complemented her melody perfectly. Together, they created something beautiful, their hands moving across the keys as if they'd practiced for years. When they finished, Mrs. Blackwell was looking at him differently than ever before, not with pity or surprise or even the respect of yesterday, but with something that looked almost like equality. "The school assembly is next Friday," she said. "Would you consider playing?" Thomas hesitated. "In front of everyone?" Mrs. Blackwell nodded. "The whole school. It would be your choice what to play." Thomas thought about his grandma's words. What would he do with the door now that it was open? "I'll think about it," he said. As he left the music room, Thomas realized something had shifted inside him. The school hallway still felt foreign, the students still stared, but now he stared back. Not with defiance or anger, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his voice in an unexpected place. The week leading up to the assembly felt like the longest of Thomas's life. Word had spread throughout Westfield Academy that the scholarship boy would be performing, and suddenly everyone wanted to be his friend. Kids who had never spoken to him now greeted him in hallways. Teachers who had overlooked him now called on him regularly in class. "It's weird," Thomas told his grandma as they sat at their small kitchen table Thursday night. "Last week I was nobody. This week everyone knows my name." His grandma passed him a plate of green beans. People are drawn to talent like moths to a flame. Some because they admire it. Some because they want to be near it. Some because they wish they had it themselves. "But they don't really know me," Thomas said, pushing the beans around his plate. "They just know I can play piano." "Then show them who you are," his grandma replied simply. "When you play tomorrow, don't just show them your fingers on keys. Show them what's in here." She tapped his chest gently. "That's the difference between someone who plays notes and someone who makes music." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what to play for the assembly. Mrs. Blackwell had suggested another classical piece, something impressive to showcase his technical skills. Mr. Reynolds, who had been giving him after-school coaching sessions all week, pushed for a crowd pleaser everyone would recognize. But neither felt right to Thomas. He slipped out of bed and padded quietly to the living room, where the old upright piano stood. In the moonlight streaming through the thin curtains, the piano looked ghostly, its chipped ivory keys glowing soft white. Thomas sat on the bench and began to play, his fingers barely touching the keys to keep the sound low. The melody was something his grandma had taught him years ago, a song she said her own grandmother had played. It wasn't fancy or complicated, but it carried something special, a history, a story, a piece of who he was. Friday morning arrived with stomach-churning nervousness. Thomas dressed carefully in his uniform, which his grandma had ironed the night before. She'd even sewed a button back on his blazer that had been hanging by a thread. "You look handsome," she said, straightening his collar, "like a real pianist." "I'm scared," Thomas admitted. His grandma smiled. "Good. Fear means it matters to you. Just remember to breathe." The school day crawled by. Thomas couldn't focus on lessons, his mind constantly jumping ahead to the assembly scheduled for the last period. During lunch, he slipped away to the music room to practice one last time, only to find a small crowd of students already gathered there, hoping to catch a preview of his performance. Finally, the last bell rang. Students streamed toward the auditorium, buzzing with excitement. Backstage, Thomas peeked through the curtains at the filling seats. The entire school would be watching, students, teachers, even some parents and board members who had been specially invited. Nervous. Thomas turned to see Mrs. Blackwell standing behind him, her usual severe expression softened with what might have been concern. "Yes, ma'am," he admitted. She nodded. "That's normal, even for experienced performers." She hesitated, then added, "Have you decided what you'll play?" Thomas took a deep breath. Something different than what we discussed. Mrs. Blackwell's eyebrows rose. "Oh, not the Chopin?" "No, ma'am. Something my grandma taught me." Mrs. Blackwell looked like she wanted to object, but instead she simply said, "I'm sure whatever you choose will be lovely." From the stage came Dr. Harrison's voice, welcoming everyone to the special assembly. "Today, we have an extraordinary musical talent to share with you. A student who has reminded us that brilliance can be found in unexpected places." Thomas winced slightly at the words, "unexpected places," like a scholarship student from the poor side of town. "And now," Dr. Harrison continued, "please welcome to the stage Thomas." The applause started before he even stepped out from behind the curtain. Thomas walked slowly to the grand piano, feeling hundreds of eyes following his every move. The spotlight felt hot and bright. He sat down at the bench, adjusted it slightly, and looked out at the sea of faces. In the front row sat Mrs. Blackwell, her posture rigid with anticipation. Next to her was Mr. Reynolds, who gave him an encouraging nod. Several rows back, Thomas spotted Ms. Winters, the English teacher who had given him the book about the jazz pianist. She smiled warmly. But the face that mattered most was in the very back of the auditorium. His grandma had taken time off from her cleaning job to be here, despite the lost wages they could hardly afford. She sat tall in her best church dress, her eyes already glistening with pride. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself the way his grandma had taught him. Then he began to play. It wasn't Chopin or Debussy or any of the classical composers they'd expected. It was the song his grandma had taught him, a melody passed down through generations, from the cotton fields of the South to jazz clubs in the city to their small living room. It started simply, hauntingly beautiful in its plainness. Then Thomas began to add to it bits of classical technique he learned over the past week, jazz improvisations his grandma had shown him, his own flourishes that seemed to flow naturally from his fingers. The piece transformed as he played, becoming something entirely new yet anchored in something very old. The auditorium was utterly silent. Even the usual shuffling and whispering had stopped. Every person sat transfixed as the music filled the space, not just technically impressive, but deeply moving in a way none of them had expected. When Thomas played the final notes, letting them fade slowly into silence, no one moved. For several heartbeats, the entire auditorium held its breath. Then, from the back row, his grandma stood up. Her hands came together in the first clap, breaking the spell. Like a wave, the applause swept forward through the auditorium until everyone was on their feet. Thomas looked at Mrs. Blackwell in the front row. Tears streaked down her usually stern face. Mr. Reynolds was shaking his head in amazement. Dr. Harrison was beaming. But Thomas wasn't playing for them. His eyes found his grandma in the back, standing tall with tears flowing freely down her cheeks, her hands clapping so hard they must have hurt. He had shown them who he was, not just a boy who could play notes on a page, but a boy with history, with roots, with soul. In that moment, as the applause washed over him, Thomas finally felt like he belonged. Not because they had accepted him, but because he had accepted himself. The standing ovation lasted so long that Dr. Harrison finally had to step onto the stage and raise his hands to quiet the crowd. Thomas sat frozen at the piano, overwhelmed by the response. He'd never imagined that sharing his grandma's song, their song, would touch so many people. "Thank you, Thomas, for that extraordinary performance," Dr. Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think we've all witnessed something truly special today." As Thomas stood to leave the stage, Dr. Harrison put a hand on his shoulder. Wait a moment, there's someone here who would like to say a few words. He gestured toward the side of the stage where a tall, elegant woman in a burgundy suit was approaching. Good afternoon, the woman said, taking the microphone. My name is Dr. Elaine Foster, and I'm the director of the National Youth Music Foundation. She smiled warmly at Thomas. Young man, in my 30 years of discovering musical talent, I have rarely been as moved as I was by your performance today. Thomas blinked in surprise. No one had told him there would be someone from a national foundation in the audience. Mr. Reynolds invited me here today, she continued, nodding toward the symphony director in the front row. He described an extraordinary young pianist, but even his glowing recommendation didn't prepare me for what I just heard. The auditorium was completely silent now, everyone hanging on her every word. Our foundation provides full scholarships to exceptional young musicians, covering not just music education, but academic support through college. She turned to face Thomas directly. We would be honored to include you in our program. A gasp rippled through the audience. Thomas felt his legs go weak. He looked desperately toward the back of the auditorium where his grandma sat, her hand covering her mouth in shock. I don't know what to say. Thomas stammered into the microphone. Dr. Foster smiled. You don't have to say anything now. We'll arrange a meeting with your grandmother to discuss the details. She turned back to the audience. What we witnessed today wasn't just technical skill. It was the voice of a true artist, someone who speaks through music in a way that transcends notes on a page. As Thomas finally left the stage, legs shaking, Mrs. Blackwell was waiting in the wings. Her eyes were red, her normally perfect makeup slightly smudged. That was not what I expected, she said quietly. It was far better. Before Thomas could respond, he was surrounded by students and teachers, all wanting to congratulate him. Through the crowd, he spotted his grandma making her way toward him, people respectfully stepping aside to let her through. When she reached him, she didn't say a word, just wrapped her arms around him in a fierce hug. Thomas buried his face in her shoulder, smelling the familiar lavender soap she always used. They want to give me a scholarship, he whispered. I heard, she replied, her voice wavering. Your mama would be so proud. Thomas felt tears sting his eyes at the mention of his mother, who had passed away when he was just 7. She had been the one who first noticed how he would hum along perfectly to songs on the radio as a toddler. The crowd around them gradually dispersed as Dr. Harrison announced the end of the assembly. Soon, only a small group remained, Mrs. Blackwell, Mr. Reynolds, Dr. Foster, and Dr. Harrison. Mrs. Johnson, Dr. Foster said, addressing Thomas's grandma, I'd like to explain our program in more detail. Perhaps we could meet in Dr. Harrison's office? As the adults walked ahead, Thomas noticed a small boy hovering nearby, a younger student he'd seen around but never spoken to. The boy looked at the floor, then gathered his courage and approached. Excuse me, he said softly. Do you think someone like me could learn to play like that? Thomas looked at the boy, skinny, with worn shoes and a too-big uniform that reminded him of his own first days at Westfield. What's your name? Thomas asked. Anthony, the boy replied. I'm here on scholarship too. Thomas smiled. Nice to meet you, Anthony. And yes, I think you could. Do you want to learn? Anthony nodded eagerly. But we don't have a piano at home, and lessons are expensive. Well, Thomas said, I happen to know there's a pretty good piano right here at school, and I could show you some basics if you want. Anthony's face lit up. Really? You would do that? Sure, Thomas said. My grandma always says music is meant to be shared. Thomas. Mrs. Blackwell's voice interrupted them. She had come back to find him. They're waiting for you in the office. She noticed Anthony standing there. Is everything all right? Thomas looked at Mrs. Blackwell, then back at Anthony. An idea formed in his mind. Mrs. Blackwell, this is Anthony. He's interested in learning piano. He hesitated, then added, maybe the school could start a program for kids who can't afford lessons. Mrs. Blackwell's eyebrows rose in surprise. Then something shifted in her expression, a new softness that Thomas was still getting used to seeing. You know, she said slowly, that's an excellent idea. We could use some of the music department budget. She smiled at Anthony. Would you like that? Anthony nodded, eyes wide. "Then I'll bring it up in today's meeting," she promised. "Now come along, Thomas. Your future awaits." 3 years later, Thomas stood in the wings of a much larger stage. The concert hall of the City Symphony was packed for the annual Young Artists Showcase. Through a gap in the curtains, you could see his grandma in the front row, wearing a new dress they'd bought specially for the occasion. Beside her sat Mrs. Blackwell, who had become a regular visitor to their home for Sunday dinners. In the 3 years since that first performance at Westfield, so much had changed. The National Youth Music Foundation had provided Thomas with the best teachers, opportunities to perform across the country, and even a new piano for their home. But perhaps the change Thomas was most proud of wasn't about him at all. It was the Westfield Academy Community Music Program, which now provided free lessons to over 30 students from neighborhoods like his. Anthony had been their first student, and now he would be performing his own piece in today's showcase. As Thomas waited for his name to be called, he thought about how a single moment, meant to humiliate him, had instead opened doors he never knew existed. He thought about all the people who had helped him along the way, including those who hadn't believed in him at first. And now, the announcer's voice rang out, our final performer, Thomas Johnson, playing an original composition titled Grandma's Hands. Thomas walked onto the stage, the spotlight finding him as he took his place at the gleaming grand piano. He looked out at the audience, at his grandma's beaming face, at Mrs. Blackwell's proud smile, at Anthony watching eagerly from the family section. He placed his hands on the keys, hands that had once trembled with fear, but now moved with confidence. The piece he would play today was special, a tribute to his grandma, to their old upright piano, to evenings spent learning songs passed down through generations. As the first notes filled the concert hall, Thomas closed his eyes and let the music speak for him. This was who he was. Not just a boy who could play piano, but a boy whose story deserved to be heard. And as the music swelled, he knew that somewhere, other children like him were waiting for their chance to be heard too. Perhaps, in some small way, he was helping to open that door for them.